Medieval warfare is often remembered through shining armor, gallant knights, and banners flying above the chaos, but the reality was far more brutal and unforgiving. Battlefields were places of confusion, exhaustion, and overwhelming fear, where weapons and tactics were designed not for honor, but for efficiency in breaking bodies and morale. Beyond the clash itself, soldiers carried the weight of wounds, disease, and trauma, while entire communities lived with the scars of endless campaigns. What legends and films rarely show is how ordinary men endured filth, hunger, and terror, while commanders relied on deception, scorched earth, and relentless discipline. The truth hides in forgotten bones, broken weapons, and the lived experience of those who survived a world where war was less about glory and more about sheer survival. Number 1. The battlefield reality. Medieval battles are often imagined as heroic clashes where knights in shining armor ride across green fields, but the reality was closer to organized chaos and sheer survival. Picture a crowded field where thousands of men, some trained but many barely equipped peasants, stood shoulder to shoulder. They weren't calm or composed. Fear ran through the lines before a single weapon was raised. Once the armies met, everything became confusion shouts. Horns and drums tried to keep formations in place, but dust, smoke, and the roar of combat made it nearly impossible to hear. Armor gave protection, but it came at a cost. A full suit could weigh more than 25 kilos, and though it was well balanced, the exhaustion built quickly. A knight or soldier might start the day strong, but after minutes of fighting, breathing inside a helmet was suffocating, sweat poured into the eyes, and strength drained fast. Hollywood usually skips over this, but fatigue decided more battles than swordsmanship. A man too tired to lift his shield was as good as dead. The ground itself turned into an enemy. After the first charges, soil churned to mud, mixed with blood, broken weapons, and bodies. Soldiers slipped constantly, and anyone who fell risked never standing up again. In the crush of thousands, being knocked down often meant suffocation, or being trampled by your own side. Horses added to the chaos. Cavalry charges looked impressive, but real animals panicked at walls of spears or the noise of arrows raining down. Many threw their riders or crashed into formations, turning an attack into deadly confusion for both sides. Weapons were not clean instruments of honor. Arrows from longbows and crossbows didn't always pierce plate armor, but they ripped through unarmored men and horses, causing panic more than mass killing. Spears and polearms dominated because they could stop cavalry and keep enemies at a distance. Close combat wasn't elegant swordplay. It was brutal grappling, smashing with pommels, hacking through gaps in armor, or crushing with warhammers designed to dent helmets and shatter bones inside. The deadliness of battle didn't only come from weapons, but from the breakdown of order. Once a formation cracked, fear spread instantly. Armies that started disciplined collapsed in minutes, and fleeing men were hunted down. The highest casualties often came during the rout, when retreating soldiers were cut apart or drowned in rivers while trying to escape. The battlefield reality was not about glory. It was about terror, exhaustion, and survival in conditions more horrific than any modern movie dares to show. Number 2. The knight's burden. Becoming a knight was less about glamour and more about years of hard preparation, responsibility, and constant strain. The journey usually started in childhood, when boys were sent away as pages in noble households. They learned to serve meals, clean weapons, and look after horses. In their teenage years, they became squires, which meant following an older knight into battle, carrying his gear, repairing armor, and even dragging him off the field if he fell. Knighthood was the reward, but it came with serious obligations to a lord and constant readiness for war. The armor that looks so majestic in museums or movies was both protection and punishment. A full set of plate could weigh 25 to 30 kilos, and though it was designed to distribute weight evenly, the strain on the body was enormous. Fighting inside it was exhausting. Breathing through a visor was difficult, vision was limited, and heat quickly became suffocating. A knight could move, run, and wrestle, but endurance drained fast. Fights weren't elegant duels, they were brutal bursts of energy. Knights half-gripped their swords to stab into weak points, swung poleaxes and maces to dent helmets or crush ribs, and used brute force just to survive. The warhorse was another burden. A destrier was not only a weapon in itself, but also one of the most expensive assets a knight owned, sometimes costing more than a peasant's farm. Keeping such animals required constant care, special feed, farriers, and equipment. Losing a horse in battle could be as devastating as losing a weapon, and many knights had to bring additional mounts just to endure long campaigns. Campaign life often weighed heavier than the actual clash of arms. Rations spoiled quickly, water sources spread disease, and marches ruined both men and horses. Illness and exhaustion killed more than arrows or swords. On top of this, knights were bound by the expectations of chivalry sworn to serve, to fight, and to uphold ideals of loyalty and faith. But reality was harsh. Campaigns relied on burning villages, seizing supplies, and capturing enemies for ransom. A knight's life was expensive, demanding, and often brutally short. Behind the shining armor and songs of glory stood men constantly carrying the weight of their gear, their animals, their duties, and the haunting memories of battles that never resembled the clean, heroic stories told later. Number 3. Weapons and tactics. Medieval warfare developed a wide range of weapons, each created not just for killing, but for exploiting the weaknesses of enemy armor, formations, and morale. Swords were not the main battlefield tool, despite their fame. They served more as status symbols and sidearms, while polearms like spears, halberds, and bills dominated real combat. These weapons gave reach, let infantry stop charging cavalry, and allowed groups of men to fight in tight formations. A wall of braced spears could break the momentum of mounted knights, forcing horses to rear or crash, creating chaos in the enemy's charge. Long weapons also worked well in the press of infantry, where striking from a distance was the only way to survive without being overwhelmed. Missile weapons were just as critical. The English longbow, trained from childhood, could send arrows hundreds of meters and deliver heavy volleys at rapid pace. While a single arrow often failed to pierce the best plate armor, massed fire rained down panic, wounded horses, and disabled lightly armored men. At battles like Cressy and Agincourt, arrows didn't wipe out armies by themselves, but disrupted formations, slowed advances in muddy ground, and left soldiers exhausted before the hand-to-hand struggle began. Crossbows played a similar role, especially in southern Europe, where they offered armor penetration with less training, though their slower reload made them vulnerable and less supported by pavises and coordinated ranks. Close combat was brutal and pragmatic. Knights and professional soldiers did not waste time with elegant swings. They aimed for gaps in armor at the armpit, groin, and visor, or used half-sword techniques, gripping the blade to thrust like a short spear. Maces, warhammers, and poleaxes were designed to dent or crush armor, inflicting internal injuries even without penetration. Battles often devolved into grappling, wrestling with steel gloves, and finishing an enemy pinned in the mud. Siege warfare showed another side of medieval tactics. Castles were not easily taken by direct assault, so attackers used trebuchets to hurl stones, flaming projectiles, and sometimes rotting corpses to spread fear and disease. Defenders poured boiling water, pitch, or sand on ladders, while mining under walls threatened collapse. Siege lines could drag on for months, and starvation or betrayal often ended them sooner than sheer force. Strategy relied on discipline and deception as much as weapons. Commanders used feigned retreats to lure enemies into traps, destroyed crops to starve advancing armies, and chose terrain carefully. Marshes, forests, and narrow passes could turn heavy cavalry from an advantage into a disaster. Victory rarely came from a single clash, but from months of grinding logistics, constant maneuvering, and the clever use of weapons that were designed for specific tactical needs. The reality was not heroic duels, but carefully layered systems of killing, breaking morale, and exploiting any weakness until the enemy collapsed. Number 4. Life beyond the fight. The end of a medieval battle rarely meant peace for anyone involved. It triggered a second phase of hardship shaped by wounds, money, law, and memory. Survivors faced crude treatment from barber surgeons who prioritized speed over finesse washing cuts with wine or vinegar, stitching where possible, cauterizing where bleeding would not stop, and amputating when limbs were shattered. Infection followed weeks later, often finishing what blades began, and long recoveries produced stiff joints, impaired vision, and lasting tremors that altered work and rank. Camp followers and townspeople improvised triage near churches or market squares, while monasteries and city hospitals took in the worst cases when armies moved on. Costs accumulated fast. Armor had to be repaired, horses shod and fed, and retainers paid. If victory delivered prisoners, captors calculated ransoms according to status and heraldic identity. That money could stabilize a household for years, but failure to secure it left veterans dependent on lords for arrears, annuities, or small pensions. Contracts of service and indentures defined wages and shares of plunder, yet delays were common. Pushing experienced fighters into seasonal mercenary work, or, in bad years, into free companies that lived by garrisons, tolls, and forced protection. Households at home felt the shock in quieter ways. Estates declined when stewards lacked labor, widows defended dower rights in manorial courts, and tenants negotiated rent relief after muster stripped fields of men and draft animals. Rural parishes raised alms for the displaced, while nobles founded chantries to pray for the dead and to anchor reputations bruised by defeat. Burial teams worked quickly, stripping usable gear and heaping bodies into trenches near chapels or along battlefield edges. Later generations collected bones into charnel spaces when farmland needed the ground. Chroniclers celebrated banners and leaders, but soldiers remembered the rout, the heat inside the helm, and the silence after horn stopped. Even in nominal peace, garrisons consumed tax revenues, border raids restarted cycles of requisitioning, and ordinances of war tried often unsuccessfully to restrain pillage. The true aftermath was administrative and psychological. Claims, pardons, lawsuits, and vows layered over fatigue and grief. While training resumed because every household with military obligations knew another levy would come. Number 5. The Forgotten Truths. Behind the polished myths sits a battlefield culture built on rules that rarely matched reality, material evidence that rarely survives, and choices shaped as much by money and terrain as by courage. Chivalry promised restraint, yet the code that actually governed conduct was written in campaign ordinances and enforced unevenly. Fines, lashes, and hangings sat alongside licensed devastation, such as the chevauchée, where burning grain and seizing livestock were deliberate tools to break an enemy's economy. Ransom was not a side note, but a business model that encouraged the capture of high-status foes, while lower ranks faced harsher fates, and the paperwork of indentures, wages, and shares of booty mattered as much as banners. The moral debates of the age were real. Church councils even tried to curb certain weapons. But on the ground, commanders picked what worked. Much that is confidently known is filtered through later storytelling. Armor did not freeze a fighter in place. Good plate spread impacts and let trained men run, clinch, and fight at close quarters, while the most effective weapons were often the unglamorous ones. Polearms, maces, and hammers aimed at joints and visors. Horses were not uniformly giant chargers. Recent archaeology shows a spectrum of types bred and managed for different jobs, and keeping them shod, fed, and healthy was a daily constraint on strategy. Arrows and bolts shattered cohesion more reliably than they pierced top-quality plate, and their real power lay in timing, terrain, and massed fire that slowed or diverted attacks into soft ground. The silence of the dead in the record is itself a lesson. Many battlefields yield few bones because graves were shallow. Later plowing and building disturbed them. And only where conditions were unusual, frozen ground at Towton, hurried burials at Visby do trauma patterns speak clearly of finishing blows, face strikes, and crush injuries in routes. Modern battlefield surveys recover scattered buckles, arrowheads, and coin losses that map movement more than heroics, and the lines they trace show plans unraveling within minutes, once mud, fatigue, and lost signals compounded fear. What remains after the trumpets is not a neat tale, but a ledger of logistics, ordinances, ransoms, veterinary problems, and mass graves that contradict the stage-managed image. The truth survives in bones, bylaws, and burned fields rather than in speeches.